today. So, going beyond choice, abortion experiences of people of colour in the UK. According to a recent report, Black women in the UK are 4 times as likely to die in childbirth as their white counterparts, while women from Asian ethnic backgrounds face a twofold risk. Women living in the UK's most deprived areas are 3 times more likely to die than those in more affluent areas. Medical progress and development are strained within racist ideology, from eugenicist theories about the bodies of people of colour to forced contraception to even the experimentation on the bodies of people of colour without their consent. The field of gynecology is rooted in slavery. Medical students of colour too face harassment and abuse in their education. What's more, women from ethnic minorities face endemic structural racism when seeking and accessing healthcare and feel that their signs and symptoms are often dismissed. Even the pain experienced by people of colour is not taken seriously compared to their counterparts, with Black patients less than half as likely to receive pain medication as white patients. And since abortion is a part of healthcare, with these discrepancies in mind, the decision-making process of people of colour about whether or not to proceed with a pregnancy goes far beyond the question of, am I ready to have a baby? More to, will I survive? Our narrative and our struggle must embrace these truths and work for change. It's time for campaigners to move away from an individualist model focused around bodily autonomy towards a rights-based framework of reproductive justice. Today, you'll join our expert panel as they ask if it's time for reckoning in the pro-choice movement. If we purport to fight for the reproductive rights of all, we cannot disavow all of this. Our narrative and our struggle must embrace these truths as we work for change. It is time for campaigners to move away from an individualist model, as I said, and this is why we're here today. So, who are Abortion Rights UK, just in case you were not already familiar with us? Abortion Rights seeks to empower women and actively campaigns for the right to free, safe, legal, local, and accessible abortion at the request of women, including in Northern Ireland, to ensure equal access to information and terminations across the UK rather than a postcode lottery, and to challenge the social stigma that continues to negatively impact women's reproductive choices. So our first speaker, Perez, is a Kenyan-born women's rights, anti-racism, and environmental activist. She's also the co-founder of Women for Wanawake, which is an intersectional women's rights organization working to empower women politically, socially, and economically, in addition to being the co-founder of the Feminist Lens podcast. Take it away, Paris.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Paris Wambui-Thuo. So I was born in Kenya, as you just mentioned, and for me, it's really important to be here representing women of colour. Obviously, I'm a woman of colour myself. And being from Kenya, I know that it's really difficult for people to access, abortion services or reproductive services. And I know that a lot of Black women suffer and, find it very difficult to access services here, me being one myself. So I think this is a good opportunity to, have a conversation, hear people's concerns, share some of the things I think that can help solve the issue. And also learn. So I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you so much, Abortion Rights UK, for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all today. Thank you.
Right then, next speaker to go on to. So we have next Zachi. So Zachi is an abortion doula, sex educator, and creator of Dopo, Support the Home of Holistic and Inclusive Abortion Care. She's also a freelance writer and content creator.
Hello everyone, thank you as well for having me. I'm Zachi. I have been an abortion doula for the past 4 or 5 years, and this year I created Dopo because the demand for support really increased last year, and I thought this is no longer something I can do by myself. So I think I will bring it back to our mission at Dopo actually in starting this conversation or being part of this conversation here, because it was a choice that I made when I was creating the website and looking at our mission of not using the word choice actually when talking about abortion. And looking at abortion, we approach it from a point of care. We don't use choice because we feel that, or I feel that it simplifies, it's a simple way to identify oneself as supporting abortion, but it can be assumptive that people having abortions always get to make the choice to terminate their pregnancies. And we know that for a large portion of people, abortion is not a choice due to health status, racism, socioeconomic status, and a whole other number of intersecting life and social circumstances. This is especially exacerbated for people of colour, Black and brown people, who are around 75% of the people I work with are Black women or Black people who have experienced abortion and are seeking support. And the model, instead of choice, that we choose to focus on is care. And looking at this trifecta of healthcare, community care, and self-care as the way forward to improving abortion care for everybody. We believe that in improving education, in improving the way we peer support as well as medical support, and then the way that we look at autonomy and people feeling empowered in their making the decisions about their lives and deciding on their futures is the way forwards. So for us, choice, and we'll get onto that more, I guess, this evening in this discussion, but our focus is care. And we choose this way to tackle this Euro-patriarchal system that we are all existing in and all navigating at all times to improve abortion support and the abortion experiences of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Zachi. That was actually very informative and very interesting. I like that perspective, actually. Thank you for that. So, next we have Edem. She's a political activist and commentator whose work ranges from feminism and anti-racism to sexual health. She is the co-director of Decolonizing Contraception, a grassroots sexual health organization, and co-host of the Sex Agenda podcast.
Thank you very much, Isadora. I'm really happy to be and also an ex-member of the abortion rights there for about 7 years. So yeah, really pleased to be here this evening and to be representing DC. But most importantly, really pleased with this panel and the way that it's been structured and the topic that we're gonna cover today, because part of decolonizing contraception work we've done recently around abortion experiences, particularly with people from African or Asian background who have accessed abortion care in England and Wales, has been very interesting, particularly when we talk to our participants around advocacy. We use the language around that it's more inclusive and more wise in order to have this discussion, have this conversation, but also lots of people in the community aren't really aware about messaging, all of that stuff. So really pleased to be on this choice, like Sachi said earlier, and talk about reproductive justice, really, which is, the right to have or not have children and the right to parent those children in safe communities, which is increasingly not becoming the case when we think about climate change, when we think about racism and how that continues to impact particularly people of color globally. So I'm going to stop there. I don't want to give it all away quite yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Edem. So I think the first thing I wanted to talk about with all of you is when we discuss abortion, we tend to usually focus on women's healthcare and human rights. However, we don't always think about talk about the accessibility to how safe abortion, how legal, making sure it's legal everywhere, and it's how it's not just about gender-based justice, but racial justice too. How do you all feel about that?
Sorry, Isadora, can you just say that again, please?
Sorry, was my internet very bad there?
Yeah, sorry, properly.
Sorry. So I said when we discuss abortion, we tend to usually focus solely on women's healthcare and human rights. However, access to safe, legal abortion is not just about gender justice, it's also about racial justice. So, I want to know your perspectives on that.
So I think it's really sad that race even plays any role in people having access or gaining access to reproductive services. I'm a big believer that we're all one human race, and it doesn't matter where you're from, what color you are. So it just saddens me. And as a Black woman myself, accessing reproductive services, I have felt, that I'm judged, or I felt like I haven't had, the right information or enough information or support and care like my white friends have had. And I think we just need to be aware that racism is like an epidemic, it's a pandemic, it cuts through everything, including health, which is a human right. And I think unless we acknowledge that and talk about it, I don't think that's ever going to change, because I think, we saw the race report that came out that said that there isn't any institutional racism in the UK, which is completely rubbish and nonsense and a lie, particularly for people like myself who experience it on a day-to-day basis. So for people to tell me that that's not true, it's ridiculous. I think the UK needs to own up that there are racisms, there is institutional racism at all levels in society, and this includes reproductive health, and that needs to be addressed. But it shouldn't be what we're addressing.
No, I completely agree with that, especially when I saw how the race report didn't, actually really factor in that a lot of the racism people receive, no one's going around with a GoPro ticking every single, there's so much that they're just not seeing. And so I think that's a really good point. What about you, Zati? Any thoughts on this?
I think it goes back to our medical system, in the sense that our medical system is based on the medical industrial complex, where it's profit driven, and then the opportunity cost of that is societal health and well-being. When you add to that then medical racism, then from the healthcare disparities that you mentioned before to the history of a lot of what we're used to as healthcare now, but the testing, like the complete disregard of Black people and Black bodies and how they've been used historically, and how they are still, the hierarchical provision of care based on race. We see Black communities that are less healthy, the disparity in healthcare, the biases of healthcare workers, and then also the lack of, which I'm so glad that DC and decolonizing contraception exists, and the research that they're doing, because we're also not included in research. We're included when they want to test on our bodies, but we're not included in, okay, how can we improve systems? But that, it all, like medical racism also has its place in furthering the medical industrial complex. So unless we look at the big system of, okay, how do we view healthcare? How do we fund healthcare? How do we value healthcare in our society? If we look at just medical racism, I think it's like putting a plaster on a much bigger problem, which is this Euro-patriarchal approach that we have to many things. And as someone that's trying to work against that system, something that I struggle with is also knowing or understanding, how do you fix a problem when I've grown up in this system, and even the solutions maybe that we're coming up with are on some way informed by these are the only systems that we know, no? So how can we be truly innovative? How can we truly F the system, to put it really politely, to create a better system, to tackle medical racism, to tackle class issues, to ensure that healthcare is not a postcode lottery, as you said before, to ensure that we as Black people, as brown people, have not the same access to care as our white counterparts, but improved care for everyone. Because care is not really caring. And if we just look to let's tackle medical racism, as you said, how do you pinpoint each case and then be I'm going to tackle this thing, and this thing and this thing. And yes, we can talk about education, and of course it's important. We need to like even just get healthcare staff and healthcare providers and educators to recognize that there is a problem, but recognizing it and then naming it, and you know, what does that process look like of someone going into work and being like, I'm going to be less racist today? Like, how does that work? Like, the whole system itself is broken, which feels overwhelming to even then sort of like look at tackling it. But I think, yes, we start with conversations, and then we also start with decolonizing the medical system. Like, and then I come back to my point about care before of like, what does care look like? How do we make the system more caring? How do we ensure that we care about everyone within the system? How do we ensure that, and even expanding when we look at reproductive justice, recognizing that housing, that parental leave, parental rights are part of the decision-making process of whether people have children or not, but recognizing that, all of these things are part of it, from housing to parental leave to sex education in schools. Like, this is all part of it. We sometimes approach the problem when it's too late, like when we've got to the end of that problem in this sense. Like, now we're talking about abortion. Abortion is affected by housing. Abortion is affected by education.
So you take a more holistic approach rather than focusing on the one. You see, quite frankly, the bigger picture, which a lot of people neglect to see. They forget that a lot of the time, if a house isn't big enough, if their earning isn't enough, if a lot of the time, if a mother cannot manage on her own due to disability or stuff, the fact that paternity leave is so abysmal in a lot of places, like, these will all impact whether someone even feels they don't feel they have a choice then, So I think that's really important to say. And I note that a lot of people may not be quite, when we talk about how Black women have been used by in medical research without their consent, a lot of people don't realize that it was, an American physician called James Marion Sims that forcibly, like, even it's hard for me to talk about because I get so infuriated about it, but he basically experimented on women, Black women who were slaves. They didn't consent. They didn't, certainly not informed consent. They went through immense amount of pain, and a lot of them, because this is where the stereotype come from that colored women don't, or women of color, they don't get, we don't feel pain as much. There's this weird concept, and that meant that he didn't actually use anesthesia on these poor women, but he did when treating white women. So there's a lot of pain and a lot of hurt when it comes to looking at that. And I think, and he's deemed the father of modern gynecology. Honestly, those women should be called the mothers of gynecology. That's what they are, because no one seems to acknowledge them. So yeah, sorry, a bit passionate.
I would just add to that as well. Like, you mentioned that, and we're talking like, I don't even know, a couple hundred years ago, but I saw a stat that I think between 50 and 70% of healthcare providers in the States, but it's comparable with stats in the UK today, still believe that Black people have a higher pain threshold. And that came from the example that you just gave. So
yeah, it's this racist
that still perpetuated today. Like,
it comes from this racist notion that women of color are less evolved somehow, and you can tell that whoever came up with this notion doesn't understand human evolution at all. It's really quite a cruel notion that has been used as an excuse to hurt women of color. It's really, So anyway, moving on from that. So how do kind of cultural assumptions of women of color, as we've discussed, kind of create barriers to access, not just to the healthcare itself, but information, the conversations? Edom, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about how particularly, you know, whether you're Black, whether you're Asian, like living in the UK and other parts of the world, you know, colonialism has had sort of a lasting legacy on all our societies, right? I say that it interrupted our ability to form the kind of world that we wanted to live in. And what we've been left with is a legacy of colonialism that we're trying to figure out, of which, you know, a lot of things are imposed on us. So when we think about, you know, abortion rights, the women's rights, the sexual and reproductive rights, and lots of other parts of the world in which colonialism happened, you would see that it's, in most cases, is quite regressive, right? It's in line with some of the, you know, some of the attitudes and presumptions that were held in, well, I said this country, but I'm actually in Ghana, in the UK, very, very long time ago. And these are the legacies that we are continuing to deal with. So that bleeds into our culture, right? Like me and my cousin make this joke a lot. Our culture, like every time we try, particularly in Ghana, every time we try to have progressive conversations with people around, you know, women's rights, around LGBT rights, it's like, oh, it's not in our culture. It's like, no, but our culture is formed out of a time that somebody imposed and ruled over us. So how do we really know that it's part of our culture? Because when we go further back, we see that we were living, you know, very different lives. I'm not going to sit here and say we were all like great and progressive, no, but our ability to find our progressive footing was interrupted with regressive ideas. So I guess the ways that these things, you know, it's very insidious, right? Because we take someone's idea of, you know, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's women's rights, all of that, we take someone's idea and then, you know, 50, 60 years down the line, we claim it's our culture. And then we have a situation where, you know, women or people are dying from, you know, backstreet abortions. People are not able to openly say that this is the healthcare or this is the service that they need. And that impacts, you know, society. People aren't able to determine how many children they want to have or whether they want to have children because they've been told that this is something that they should do. So I guess we've got a really long way to go. And I guess, like, sometimes I get really frustrated because the West now gets to, like, you know, claim monopoly on progressiveness, right? Like, they turn around and they say, oh, these African countries, you know, do exactly X, Y, Z, or these Asian countries do this. And, you know, they over there, they hate LGBT people. And it's like, nah, but like 20 years ago, you hated LGBT people. In fact, you also put it in law. So they get to, you know, they get to evolve now and then be the more arbitrator of who's progressive and who isn't. Meanwhile, they've left us a legacy in which we're fighting to even get out of. And I'll tell you something really ridiculous. In Ghana, a former British colony, on the school curriculum, they teach young people the benefits of colonialism. That's the legacy that we're still having to deal with today. And it's going to impact all society. It's going to impact Ghanaians living in the UK because we're also very connected to our culture. We're connected to people back home. All of those things add up together. So I'm going to stop there because I'm going to take too much time.
No, I appreciate the response, and I've learned a lot just in that because I completely agree. People tend to forget. There was, I think, there was quite a regressive law in India, and you know, Britain was harping on about it. And when you look back, it was actually made by British rule in India, and you're like, oh,
right. They
well,
put them on
awkward.
The statute. Right. It's like, it's such a formal, like, international way of gaslighting you, right? It's like put something on the books and then leave and turn around and say, well, you're doing this thing, you need to stop it. It's like, hang on a minute, you taught us to do these things, right? And like, you've just reminded me, we had Sangeeta on the podcast, The Sex Agenda, who does the Masala podcast, who does like a lot around Asian women, exploring their sexuality, their bodies, and in some ways also tackles a lot of how colonialism impacts the way that people like interact now. And she talks a lot about how, you know, like sexuality and freedom, when we think, for example, like Kama Sutra, which everybody, you know, wants to put down to sex positions, which is a lot more expansive than that. It talks about how, you know, liberated Indian society was compared to now. And again, that's a direct, you know, legacy of colonialism. So
yeah. Oh, we have a question from the audience. It said, I would like to ask, how can I, as a white midwife working for a major abortion provider, can be a good ally and advocate for people of color in my care?
That's a really good question. And I think one way I would suggest is speaking to your Black and Asian colleagues and asking them, how can I help you get the message across? How can I help you change the system? Because what I think is important is that we have Black and brown people leading on this change. It's all about representation. There's another reason why there's so much misinformation about Black bodies, because we don't have enough people of color in these senior positions or to, to create change. So rather than spearheading this change, rally around your Black and brown colleagues, and uplift them, and go to your senior managers and say, we need to be doing more about this, but we want the Black colleagues and the brown colleagues to lead and tell us what we should be doing. Because sometimes I feel with all the best intentions, you find that there are going to be Caucasian people leading on the change about diversity and ethnicity, which is great, but I think we need someone who actually lives it to be able to lead on that.
Yes, because I've noticed sometimes when, you yourself haven't suffered from a problem, you don't know how to correctly go about it. And then sometimes the solutions that are posed don't come, it is more like posturing than actual helping. And, it's something that happens quite accidentally a lot of the time. So that's why I think it's so important to actually speak to the people who have been in positions who can actually inform the decisions. So, yeah, no, good point. So, coming back to the...
jump in?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Really specifically, because I've just led on a bit of research that was done, really talking to women who have had abortion in England and Wales about like the experience, and it was a very interesting couple of weeks when we did the focus group and stuff. And what I would definitely say is that it's twofold. I think that I think that it's important for people in the medical field, like whether it's abortion care or whether it is, if you're committed to, a just, a fairer society, to really become aware about some of the histories and the atrocities, particularly in the medical field, that have been committed against like people of color communities. Because I think there's something about being aware, meaning that you are able to empathize and you are able to reassure patients when they come to you. I think that that's incredibly important, because a lot of times, like, people come into healthcare and they might not be able to articulate like the fears or the things that's setting them, that's holding them back. But that is there. And if you have that knowledge, if you understand that this person is coming from a community or is coming from a certain background and might be aware of X, Y, Z that has happened, you're able to reassure, you're able to empathize, and you're able to have a conversation that's like, that would even make the person feel like, okay, you're taking my concern seriously because you are aware of this particular issue. And then the second thing I would say as well is that, particularly around, so like a lot of the participants talked about, and I mean, this could happen to anyone, not just to people of color, but, because of obviously some of like the cultural stuff around abortion and stuff, it meant that, at that particular time accessing care, they were alone, and they felt that, the medical professionals that were looking at them were very, very in and out, very cold, not very warming, not very reassuring. So I guess that's the other thing that was there. I mean, that could happen to anybody from any background, but specifically with the research we did, a lot of people had to, go through that process alone, because there were very little people in their life at that particular time that they could express what was happening or could come along and support them for lots and lots of different reasons. So that's what I'll say. I think Zalchi's got a hand up.
Oh, yeah. Yes, actually.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say really quickly, I think sometimes with looking at diversity, we can fall into this idea of a numbers game, that if we have enough like Black or brown staff members, then the problem's solved, when actually the people that need to do the most work, as Edom said, is like inform yourself. That's the most that you can do. Like, you don't need to put like your Black or brown colleagues on the spot and be like, hey, you speak up. Like, no, you do the work. Like, understand the system that you're working in, understand like how race intersects here. Also look outside of healthcare, understand how different things intersect with healthcare and abortion care, and and also like exercise your, I'm not going to say that, because whoever you're voting for in the UK is just a mess right now, so forget politics, like just forget that. But inform yourself and educate yourself, and call out your colleagues when you see things. Like, call out your white colleagues. You're in a much better position to call them out when they do something that is harmful or racist. than...
Because there is this stereotype, isn't there, where if a woman of color says something, then we're angry or we're bossy or we're I've heard playing the race card. It's, racism isn't a fun card to play. I don't even know how they could say that. So this, so I completely agree that someone who is a white colleague in a white majority country, that too, would be in a much stronger position to help out. So yeah, I completely agree with that, Sachi.
Colleagues listen, and as Edom says as well, like, don't assume that you know why someone is there. Don't assume about, like, make assumptions about their lives, about why they are seeking care. Provide care. And I would also say, again, this goes beyond race, of like, there is, from people I've spoken to and also how I've experienced abortion care, there is a hierarchy in like who is deserving of this abortion and why, and who gets better care and why. And that also needs to be addressed, for everyone that seeks abortion care. Of like, there's, if you're seeking an abortion because of, I don't know, the pregnancy is already ended or something like that, then you're shown compassion. You're shown like, oh, how can we support you? But if you're going there because you've chosen that you don't want to continue with that pregnancy, and you're Black and you're younger, that's like, oh, look at this stereotypical. Like, don't assume, and like, stop with the hierarchy. Like, show everyone the same level of care, the same level of attention, the same level of respect, regardless of why they are there. Why they are there is irrelevant. They're there. Your job is to provide care. And remember the care in healthcare. Like, so many people forget that. Be a decent human being.
To improve these situations, abortion has still a stigma around it. How do we fight for reproductive justice when abortion is still in so many places, and even in the UK, still sometimes such a cultural taboo? Paris, you haven't said so. Tell me, Paris, your thoughts.
So how do we fight stigma?
Like, how do we fight for this justice when there is the stigma? How do we then navigate around the stigma and still reach that equality?
I think there's a few things. I think the first thing would be education. I think we all need to be educated on what an abortion is, and also the reason why people have abortions. I think people don't realize that people have abortions not just because they don't want to have children. It could have a risk to their life. They might not be ready, or they don't want children. So I think just understanding some of the reasons as to why. I know it doesn't matter, but I think the only way we're going to be able to reach these people that have a very negative view of it is letting them know that everyone has their own reason, and we don't have to understand, but these are some of the reasons that it could be. Again, I'm big on representation. I think having people from different communities, different backgrounds coming together, advocacy, and raising awareness on what abortions are, and also engaging, particularly, I'm probably speaking more from an African perspective, but engaging with like faith groups, faith leaders, who have a big part to play in what cultures and communities think about certain things such as reproductive rights. So really engaging with everyone at all the levels of community and having them represented in these kind of forums to bring people together. And the overarching thing being like, you don't have to like why somebody, has a boy, you don't have to agree with it, but this is someone's choice. So yeah, those are the few things that I would say could help fight stigma.
Okay. No, I think, greater kind of dialogue between people and more education around the matter. The one thing that was quite shocking, I found, with a lot of people who were quite anti-choice, was that they didn't quite realize how much pregnancy can affect the body and someone's health. They didn't, because I'm currently in neurology, so I know from looking at the research how the brain itself can change in irreversible ways, and usually does. And just, it's not something you can zip through in 9 months and then go back to the way you were. No, you're never the same again. And the fact that there's not enough compassion about how someone needs to be ready before going through that, I think that would be need to be communicated as well to a lot of people who may not even understand that.
And also, just before we move on to the other panelists, also changing the view of how women's bodies and the role of women how we see what women should do, and childbirth, all these type of things. I think we really need to change all that, because that's another problem as to why we have men saying that women shouldn't be having abortions, and they're the ones who are sitting there in a room deciding whether women can or can't. So challenging and changing. So we would need to have men as our allies who are who are pro-choice, to kind of dispel these crazy primitive ideas of women, and what they're supposed to be doing, and the fact that every woman should have a child. There's many women that do not want to have children, and if they accidentally fall pregnant, they do have the right and the choice to terminate that baby, if that's how they feel. So, or that fetus, So yeah, it's just kind of changing people's ideas on women.
No, I completely agree with that. And one would think with, the kind of population boom we're having on Earth and running out of resources, people would think twice about this whole everyone needs to have a child thing, So what does inclusive campaigning look like? Sati, why don't you give me a view on that?
Minutes, think about that. What does inclusive campaigning look like?
Yeah, like, a lot of these groups, a lot of the time, they're doing what they can in terms of being pro-choice, but how do we make sure that it's not just, not just looking after pro-choice, but looking after especially the choice of women of color, which are often more restricted due to various factors?
I think there is of course something to be said that making sure that, like, I don't know, I've heard it recently. I think ensuring that the voices of the most marginalized in whatever space you're campaigning for, and now we're talking about abortion, are also the voices that you're amplifying. Because I think even in this space as well, we talk about abortion as women's rights. I support people of different genders who have had abortions and who are also not included. And I think, when we look at improving care or campaigning for the most marginalized, even if they are maybe the minority of that group that we're campaigning for, we can improve the system for everyone. If not, we end up very much in this sort of like white feminist rights campaigning, which reproductive justice is not. Reproductive justice is like this whole holistic view of, or this holistic approach to campaigning, to improving futures, to improving the lives, to improving the autonomy of people. And and I've seen it happen in the abortion space. It's like women's rights, and then it's like, okay, but we can talk about women and pregnant people. I'm not saying like don't use the word women, but we can expand our vocabulary. And then the response is, yes, but it's mostly women. And it's like, okay, so now we're going to create a hierarchy in our campaigning of whose rights we're fighting for. And then when we've got women's rights, like, how do we even know when we've got women's rights? And then after we've got women's rights, we're going to fight for the rights of then Black women, and then after Black women, we're going to fight for the rights of other people that have abortions. And that's what I'm saying. If we include and lift up the voices of the most marginalized in the areas that we're campaigning for, everyone else is included. It's only when we include the people at the top or the majority that everyone else gets excluded. So that's how I would approach inclusive campaigning.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. And I think, there's a lot to be said about how rather than fighting for one group, you fight for, everyone's reproductive rights, especially anyone who could have the risk of being pregnant. And, because for centuries that's been used against people, pregnancy, to control them, to often trap them. So that's why I think this is such an important topic. So there was this kind of question for, is it time for campaigners to move away from this individualist model focused just bodily autonomy of individuals, more towards a rights-based framework of reproductive justice? Because I think it's so easy for people to say to be individualist, but then when you look at the statistics of the amount of Black women dying, it's not very individualist. It's still somehow going into these very distinct groups and outcomes. What do you think of that, Eden?
Yeah, before I answer that, I just had two things of the previous questions that you asked, so I hope it's okay for me to just go for it.
Of course.
Okay, I'm gonna go for it. Yeah. So previously, yeah. So this is the previous question before. So yeah. So again, like I'm just going back to like the piece of work I did last year around, you know, abortion experiences, and it's very interesting because when you look at the data, particularly for England and Wales, the 2019 data, which I think will be the most current because we just wrapped up 2020, but I think that did come out too. I'll just go with the 2019 data. It says 8% of black people had abortion. I'm going to say people because I'm not going to assume everyone identifies as a woman. People had abortion, so like 8% of that. And when you think about what the black population is, that's in England and Wales, that's about 150,000 people. If I've done my maths right, I think I have done my maths right. Unless I've done my maths wrong, I think I might have done my maths wrong. But anyway, the number is there, and we are definitely like represented, right? But the issue is like people don't talk about it, and it's definitely the stigma. And I'll tell you a story. One of the participants in the focus group, she said to me she had her first abortion when she was around 16, and her mother arranged that. This participant is of Nigerian descent. Their mother was born and raised in Nigeria and moved here, right? Their mother organized their abortion because their sister had gotten pregnant, and it was like, no, we're not doing that. You're not having a child. You need to like do something with your life, etc., etc., right? They later on found out when they were older through just like, you know, one day being with family in the kitchen, the women were talking. So their mother had had 2 abortions previously. And this is something that their mother never said to them, never spoke to them. When they had their abortion, their mother was like, okay, great, that's done. Didn't have a conversation with them, didn't comfort them, didn't open up to them and say, oh, I've been through this too, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that's because of the shame and the stigma, right? That even 2 people can be in a family who have gone through something very similar, but the shame and stigma is so strong that they're not able to provide each other comfort at a very difficult time. So when we think about, you know, advocacy, and we're talking about reproductive justice, and we're moving away from choice and just, you know, just from abortion, because abortion care is part of like reproductive justice. I think, you know, it's no coincidence that Black women were the women to form this framework, because you made it expansive, right? So people could be around or behind this campaign for lots of reasons, right? It's not just an abortion campaign. So you're not identified. You know, somebody might be pro-choice, and, you know, again, that's the question we asked a lot of the participants. We said, you know, were you pro-choice before your abortion? How did it make you feel? And a lot of people, majority of people were strongly pro-choice. Some people didn't know. Some people didn't realize they were pro-choice till they needed an abortion, right? So having a reproductive justice framework, doing advocacy work that is expansive and isn't just around a single issue of abortion, to come and be part of the actual part of the campaign, because then you're now not identifying one person. You're not identifying this person as being, you know, supporting pro-choice. They can be part of this organization. It's like this organization that's lots of things, including abortion care. They could be pro-choice, but they just don't want to be publicly, you know, giving off that position for lots and lots of different reasons. And that's why I think it's really important that we frame abortion care, we frame reproductive care in a reproductive justice framework. And it's no surprise that, you know, Black and Indigenous women were the women to create that field, because it means that you could pull more people in together, right? And I think that that's what we're missing in terms of like the abortion advocacy space in the UK. Sadly, you know, and this is not to call anybody out, you know, I understand, like, you know, a lot of these organizations, people are having to give up their free time, right? Like I was on the abortion exec for like 7 years. Like you have to give up your time to do this. Not all Black women or people of color are able to do that. When we think about, you know, Black people are more likely to live in poverty, more likely some of the poorest areas, especially if you're a Black woman with kids. You've got to think about childcare and your family and stuff. It's actually a really big privilege to be able, a lot of times, if you're not doing paid advocacy work, to just be in the abortion advocacy space. You have to have a lot of privilege. You have to have a lot of things in your life. You know, I don't have kids, so I don't have to worry about childcare. That allows you to engage in that space. And right now, the space isn't set up in a way that these kinds of people that we know, that we are aware are missing from this space to be able to engage. And I think that, you know, it's really important for all the different organizations to come together and start talking to each other and start to create a space in which, you know, Black women, Asian women can come and be a part of that is about abortion advocacy, but in a way that they're able to engage and be a part of that, and that doesn't put them off. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. No, I agree to that, because a lot of the time, you know, even now I'm you know, quite stretched thin being able to do this, and it is taking a lot of time, and you know, it is a privilege to be able to organize my life in a way that I can do this. So that is a, you know, it is a very good point. I was also going to say that, you know, when we were talking about how sometimes, you know, talking about it as if it's a choice comes from, say, quite a position of privilege, because a lot of the time people don't quite have that choice. And so would one say that it, you know, that concept of you always have it as a choice, kind of ableist, or maybe from a position of some white privilege, perhaps? Sachi, do you want to expand on how you feel about that? Because I know you had quite some strong opinions on this.
I think that choice can limit how much we improve the system, because I think all of us work around reproductive health or with abortion rights. So you know we sometimes fall into this echo chamber of also understanding and seeing the intricacies of the system and where it doesn't work. But I think, you know, and I guess this goes back to your question before of when we are looking for funding, when we're looking to for our organizations, or like more further funding in abortion or around abortion, whether that's research or whatever, when we focus abortion on choice, it does narrow, like, I feel like I'm just repeating myself, but it does narrow like the way we look at care, the way we look at funding, because especially in an English context, it's like, well, people have access to it, you know, it's like legal, so why do we have to continue campaigning for this? So limiting choice, I think, limits focusing on choice and just like making abortion synonymous with, are you pro-choice or are you anti-abortion, really does limit the conversations that we can have of where there are cracks in the system and where we need to address them. And yeah, the need to address them, the need for funding to address them, the need for time to address them, the need for putting groups together that do not just campaign for choice or rights around abortion, although we do know that that is incredibly important. And I'm talking about this in an English context, and I know that that is not the same when we move around the British Isles. But which is why I think we really do need to move beyond choice and beyond calling ourselves, you know, pro-choice, and also, especially in a UK context, look at what reproductive justice looks like in our backyard and how we can really start to, move forwards with that.
So from your perspective, it's about giving, by once again, that more holistic approach, so that it's not just, oh, well, they have the choice then and there when it happens, but giving them so many options throughout their life that they can shape it to more what they want, and they don't feel restricted in the future. Is that what you're saying? So, you know, to be able to have that housing, to be able to quite early on, rather than, you know, oh, I'm pregnant, do I need to terminate, much before it even gets there. To form that. Yeah, no, okay, I like that.
Like looking at abortion as part of reproductive health, but also looking at reproductive health. And if we like I feel like I'm worried that reproductive justice will be the new buzzword, and that actually change won't happen. That everyone will be like, yes, we are, our policies, our actions are based on the reproductive justice framework. Like, show us then.
Okay.
How much do you talk about? How does your, like, the work you're doing in your organization intersect with campaigns that are like, for paternal leave, for 0 hours contracts, for housing, for sex and relationships education in schools? That is reproductive justice.
Okay.
that is reproductive justice. It's not just saying, yes, we're pro-choice and we believe in reproductive justice, which I heard someone say this week. It's like,
no, I agree with you. So we have 8 minutes left. So I would like each of you to kind of summarize your feelings on this and sum up what we've discussed today. And for the attendees, there is a link to the next event in the chat. So Paris, do you want to start off on your summing up?
Sure. So some of my takeaways, I think it's important that we listen and respect everybody's opinions and views and where they're coming from in terms of looking at abortions and reproductive health. I think we need to be careful not to be too prescriptive about saying, is this not a women's rights thing, or this is reproductive justice, this, if we're going to reach as many people as we can to try and make a positive change, we need to sometimes use some of the language that people might think is problematic. But at the end of the day, some of these people who have very old-fashioned views need to be talked to in that kind of way. So therefore, we need to reach these audiences. As I mentioned, I think 2 or 3 times, representation is very important to me. I think I definitely would like to see more people of color in, health services, because they can best understand people of color going into these services and know how to empathize with them, understand kind of the care that they need. So I again would stick to what I said, and I think it is very important. I think also empowering and uplifting. So, our white brothers and sisters, empowering and uplifting their Black brothers and sisters and brown brothers and sisters, and using their position to help us be able to make a change. That's really, really important. I also think we should also be looking at the impact or the link between reproductive rights and the environment. There are statistics that show that there is a correlation, which if we empower more people with reproductive rights, that can help the environment. And I'm very passionate about the environment. And I think it's just really important to have conversations like this. So it's really nice to be here today and hear from people. But I think the most important thing is respect, openness, and understanding from different people and their opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paris. Very well said. Edom, what about your little summary now?
So I mean, I think that it's really important to not assume that just because we don't visibly see people that, like, perhaps the work isn't being done. As somebody who's been on the executive or previously been on the executive of abortion rights UK, and raised a lot of issues that pertain to, like, Black women of color. There have been, Asian members of the exec as well, and all these issues have been raised. And I guess goes by the point I was making earlier, like, somebody doesn't need to be the face for something for the issues that they, face to be addressed. And particularly when we talk about the healthcare industry, it's very interesting, like, when we talk about diversity in the healthcare industry, because actually the healthcare industry is very diverse. Like, there are lots of Black and Asian people working in healthcare. And I think, again, it goes back to the system. If the system you're operating in, and it's actually said this earlier, isn't really, like, formulated in a way that allows you to give people care, whether they're Black or white, that then becomes the issue, because then the healthcare system isn't necessarily caring, and that's a problem. So I think that's important. And I'm gonna go politics here, because in the last decade, we've seen our National Health Service completely decimated and underfunded, and it just makes the job even harder, right? Like, we talk about diversity, that's going to fix the issue, but actually the NHS also needs money. Like money is the thing that's going to help us address some of these disparities and help us fix these issues. So help us, educate people working in the healthcare industry about the history of healthcare and eugenics and how we've ended up the way that we have, and how, subconsciously it's informing the way in which they give care to people, right? So that's incredibly important. And our NHS is being completely decimated. I mean, somebody who wants to be the head of the NHS publicly said the other day that they would like to end the reliance of quote unquote foreign workers on the NHS, which is funny, really. Not funny as in ha. It's almost ironic because a lot of people that work in the healthcare industry are from India, for example, or even places like the Philippines, which means that people in the Philippines and India can't get the healthcare that they also deserve, right? So there's a direct legacy of colonialism and its impact that we're seeing in that respect. So and again, back to Zachi's point about reproductive justice, don't just say it's about reproductive, show us. And Perry said this earlier, like, let's talk about how the environment is climate change is a reproductive justice issue. We had a young Black girl pass away a few years ago because the air she was breathing around the house was killing her. And her mom said if she had knew, she would have packed up her stuff and moved that Black girl immediately. Black people live in some of the most polluted areas in the UK. That's a reproductive justice issue because people cannot parent their children in societies that will allow them to live till at least 10 years old. Like, that girl died when she was, 8, I believe? So that's all reproductive justice issues. And again, we shouldn't just say, we have to show it through our action. So all these different organizations should be talking to each other. Like, the abortion rights savers should be talking to, the movement around the environment and climate change, because all of those things are linked. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting take. And so Zachi.
I feel like Paris and Edem already said it all. But I won't repeat what they've said. The only thing that I would reiterate or add is the need for reproductive justice, not within just our organisations, but like this framework, this holistic view also within the healthcare system. And I know we're running for time. I would also mention within our own communities a more not openness, but having these dialogues within churches, within community spaces, within our families feels like at a push. Like, even when I started working in this work, my family was like, well, why are you working in abortion? Now they get it, but like within our communities, within our family groups, with the younger generation as well, and let them know that, this is part of life, that your reproductive experiences, we've all been there. Someone's been there. Talk. And reminding them that these are safe spaces.
No, I think that's really important. Thank you, Sachi. Well, thank you, for all three of you, for being such wonderful panelists today. That's been really informative and very interesting. And thank you for everyone who attended. Remember that, abortion rights membership is a very worthwhile thing to have and quite cheap, so do chip in.